Usually when a market catches fire, you have to look at where the money is coming from. Because for a market to catch fire in the collectibles business in the year 2023, there's a significant amount of money being pumped into that market. So if you follow that money, that's where it's going to tell you, okay, this is either legitimate, this is hype driven, this is complete market manipulation, or it's somewhere in between.
Hey guys, before we get into the show, we need to take a quick moment to shout out our sponsors. First up, Ultra Pro. Ultra Pro has the best protective materials for your card, gaming, or even comic book collecting needs. Here in their shop, they have all sorts of goodies like top loaders, bags and boards, and even UV protected holders. And the best part is, if you head over to their online store, ultrapro.com, and use my promo code SWAGGLE, which you'll see in the description, you'll be able to save 5% off on your next order. Again, that is ultrapro.com. Use promo code SWAGGLE to save 5%. This episode of Swagglecast is also sponsored by me. Yes, that's right, Swagglehoss. Did you guys know I wrote a comic? It's called Sanity: Rise of the Occult, a Lovecraftian pulp adventure that pays homage to the detective style of comics from the Golden Age. Start improving your comic collection today by picking up a copy at swagglehosscomics.com. Again, that's swagglehosscomics.com. Pick up a book and also consider grabbing some of that sweet Swagglehoss or Sanity merch. All these little purchases and your support help me keep the channel going and bring you guys the best possible content I can. Thank you all so much for watching. And now, with that out of the way, let's get on with the show. All right. Well, I am with Shawn from Reserved Investments. Shawn, thank you so much for taking the time today and coming on the channel.
Thank you for having me. I greatly appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, definitely. It's cool to get the chance to talk to you, get the chance to meet you here. I very much am a fan of your YouTube channel and all the content that you make. You live in my head fairly rent free. Every time I think about taking out a second mortgage on my house and going all in on New Mutants 98, I think, Shawn's going to hit me in the face with a stale bagel or something like that. He's going to advise me against this. But I'm familiar with your YouTube and the work that you do, but maybe those who are watching, if they're not, maybe you can give them a quick little introduction or overview of who you are and what you do.
Sure. My full name is Shawn Surmick. I founded Reserved Investments back in 2015. I have a lot of experience in the antiques and collectibles trade. I've been operating in the trade since the ripe young age of 12. So I have many, many decades of experience because I assure you, I am much older than I look. Within the next month or so, I will be 47 years of age. So I've been in these markets for well over 30 years at this point. With that being said, I do write for Antiques and Auction News on a biweekly basis. I have a consulting business dedicated to the antiques and collectibles trade. And of course, as already stated, I do have a YouTube channel called Reserved Investments. What I do on my channel is a little bit different than what you guys are probably used to. I teach true collectible finance, not hype-driven collectible investing, all of this speculation that you see across the board. I teach the fundamentals as to how to analyze these markets over the short term and over the long term. So if you do choose to diversify into antiques as collectibles as part of your investment portfolio, you don't get slapped in the face with a stale donut. That's pretty much my stick.
Yeah, very. I think it's very accurate from at least what I've gathered with you and watching your stuff. And actually, I kind of wanted to start it right there. You mentioned not being kind of this hype driven, collectible thing or speculation or overly speculative in that sense, and actually how to fundamentally analyze stuff. And, when I watch your videos, I get a good sense that you have a very healthy, maybe skepticism towards collectibles. Maybe that makes some people in the comments feel one way about you if they're like, oh, Shawn, it would just be better if you pumped up this book that I'm trying to sell right now. But could you maybe unpack that a little bit? I mean, from what I gather, I get the sense that it's you're probably coming from a place where you are genuinely maybe looking out for the people that want to get involved in this, and maybe you've seen a lot of mistakes made along the way, or maybe you yourself have made a lot of mistakes and throughout your career just learning this stuff. Like, where does that where does the reserved come from, reserved investments, especially when it applies to the collectible side of things?
Well, sure. When we look at any asset class as an investment, the best asset classes to invest in over the long term have cash flows that are directly linked to them. When we look at cryptocurrency, when we look at gold, silver, when we look at collectibles as a whole, none of those particular asset classes have direct underlying cash flows that are linked to them. And what I mean by that is if you want to invest in an S&P 500 index fund, that's pretty much made up of 500 and some of the largest companies on earth where you can look, they're publicly traded companies. You can look at all their underlying fundamentals. You can study all of their makeup, how they allocate capital, income from sales, anything that you want to look at that you're taught in a hardcore finance setting. Like if you went to business school or finance school, you're going to learn all of those fundamentals. When it comes to antiques, collectibles, any of these other asset classes that I mentioned, there are no underlying fundamentals. As a result, they're inherently riskier than putting all of your money in a well-diversified portfolio. So therefore, you should be diversifying into these markets. It should never be the main course. So let's start there because that's something that I think is missing from a lot of the hype-driven content that is on YouTube that pretty much sucks people in with nostalgia where they go, oh my gosh, I love Batman or I love Spider-Man. Let's just bet the farm. It's an investment. Look at what comics have done over the last, 20, 30, 40 years without understanding why comics performed in that manner. And I think this is where we have to start. After that, I can answer confidently that being in these markets so long, I've seen the long-term effects and the risks of people attempting to invest in these markets for 10, 20, 30 years. I myself have made some mistakes. Now, I learned from those mistakes. I do a lot better than most other investors in these markets simply because I know how to recognize speculative bubbles. And again, I don't allow myself to get completely emotionally attached to these items. I recognize I have the nostalgia, but I'm able to control it a little bit better than most of the other individuals that are just coming into these markets that do not have the background or the experience to know how these markets work over a 10, 20, 30-year cycle.
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting world just in the collectible space because it is this like, emotional side of it, right? Where because we all love these characters, we all, have nostalgia and a fondness for whatever. I had this toy when I was a little kid, or I had this comic book when I was younger, and now I want it again in a CGC 98 or whatever the case is. And that is in opposition to what is maybe the best investing financial decision that you can make when it comes to some of these items. So it's a very difficult balance, and I think a lot of people are always trying to figure out the best way to kind of play in this space, and that's probably where you also get a lot of friction because there's two sides of it, right? Where there's on my channel, which primarily we focus on comic books, like there's clearly this dichotomy and almost like an allergy to like, the investing side of a comic book or the value side of a comic book to just people who like to sort of collect. So it's really an interesting market to exist in and to, have a career in, I guess, is to advise on collectibles as a whole.
It's very interesting. Yes.
Yeah. Let me ask this. I think it's in this last like couple years, I want to kind of relate it specifically to comics because I think that people would love to hear, sort of your outlook on it. The comic space, obviously in 2021, I guess every collectible space, but we'll focus on the comic side, obviously blew up. We had this COVID money, we had, interest rates getting cut, we had money being thrown into the markets, on the macro scale, and that inflating other things and speculative stuff. And then coupled with that, you have, Marvel movie speculation and all this stuff going on. You have this sort of perfect bubble to create this bubble. And now we're feeling it all sort of deflate out. We're seeing pullbacks. Later we'll talk about, some specific ones of like Action Comics, selling for $1 million less and some of these notable things and corrections. But this is sort of like an unprecedented time, at least as far as I can tell, when I look at GPA and graphs and stuff like this sort of pullback, this sort of correction. What has been your sense of this and people that you've talked to in this particular time, or how would you advise certain people? Like, obviously you gave a preamble talking about like, oh, these things are risky, there's risk to this, but it seems like if you bought at the height of 2021 and now you're whatever, 100% in the red, that's a risk that is even, bigger than what you would normally expect a risk to be. Like, is that something that you, or I should say, what do you think about this last couple of years and where we're at?
In all honesty, if you bought at the height in 2021, you're going to have a costly lesson
Hmm.
because most likely a lot of those books, some will come back to those highs. That's very possible. It happens in every market. But for the most part, a lot of the books were overpriced even back then. And now I think that people are realizing that, especially given you always have to look at the overall state of the economic environment you're investing in. And right now, you can get over 5% just by parking your money in a money market fund with
Hmm.
virtually no risk. So this affects the collectibles market because high profile investors, even people like myself, for me now to go after a $5 or $10,000 comic book or a rare coin, it has to be that much appealing to me where I can realistically say, I'm going to give up that 5% return to buy this particular item. And even then, it's still a gamble because we don't know how quickly or even if there's a big what if here. Is the market going to bounce back? Is it ever going to get the heights to where it was even before 2021 when the Marvel Cinematic Universe was going strong, where Marvel didn't admit they had all these problems, where now they want to bring back Iron Man, played by
Yeah.
Robert Downey Jr., and they want to bring back Chris Evans because they're claiming now they don't know where they can even go with the Marvel Universe anymore. And that was a catalyst that contributed to these high prices.
Yeah.
So where do you go from here when we've already hit the proverbial peak? And we're seeing this in a lot of markets. Look at the market for Pokemon. Look at the market for graded video games in the subsequent crash. A lot of people are getting hurt because, again, we have to get back to basics. Investing in antiques and collectibles has literally been here now since the 1970s and the 80s is when it picked up steam with rare coins, people on Main Street thinking that they were going to invest like people on Wall Street. And it didn't work well for them over the years. If you chart the graphs, that's why a lot of baby boomer collectibles right now, Schwinn bicycles, Pez dispensers, toy robots, vintage tin toys, Lionel trains, all of those markets are steadily dying. And there's a lot of people that have their head in the proverbial clouds thinking, well, this can't happen to my beloved comic books. To be fair, comic books do have a lot of cross collectible appeal, meaning they appeal to more than one generation. But make no mistake, what we're seeing and what we've seen in 2020, 2021, that was not the norm. And it never should have been taken as the norm. And that's where my heart goes out to those individuals, especially if they're younger, because it was probably their first speculative bubble along with possibly crypto and other speculative assets. My advice to those individuals would be to learn from this and understand that this is why you cannot put all your money in extremely speculative collectibles for the long term or other asset classes. You have to build a well diversified portfolio and then diversify into these markets. If you want to buy in the comic books, you can make an argument certain comic books are worth holding for the long term. But you have to be realistic about that approach. And that's where I come in and try to teach that on my channel.
Right. Right. I want to pull out two of the things you said. You said for the long term, and then you also mentioned how like the Pez stuff and the Schwinns and stuff, like all of that stuff has sort of aged out. Yeah, I couldn't help but notice, the ones that you even have above your shoulder.
Yeah,
Can you talk about that a little bit? Like, I find it interesting with comics
sure.
because so far, if we go back to say Action One, 19, what is it, 37 or 39, we're almost at 100 years. What's your general sense? Like, I don't know if comic books are considered sort of the first like pop cultural collectible, but what's your sense of comic books being unique to this space as far as like, is this something that, 30 years from now, 40 years from now, no one's going to care about? We're all going to be living in meta, like with our NFTs? Or is it like, is there something a little bit different in your estimation with a comic book versus, say, a Pez dispenser or a Beanie Baby or something like that?
It is a little bit different, but you have to kind of look how we got here.
Mm.
Literally, there was a time, believe it or not, where a lot of the coveted vintage comics that we now hold dear, your Detective Comics 27, your Action Comics 1, if you go back to the early 1990s, After the modern era comic book bubble burst, remember when manufacturers came into that market and you had Valiant and you had all
Yeah.
these other manufacturers doing holofoil, 4 different covers that you had to go to the comic book store and buy because your investment portfolio wouldn't be complete. And then 30 years would come by and you wouldn't have any retirement income because you didn't invest in these overproduced hot books back in the day. Well, after that burst, there was a time period, believe it or not, where a lot of the hardcore key vintage comic books today that are coveted and sought after, they dropped in price.
Mm.
And if you go and you study the history of this, you can actually chart it. As a matter of fact, I recommend people that argue with me with this, I tell them, go and dig up some older copies of the Overstreet comic book price guide from the 1990s. You can usually get them really cheap, and you can literally chart this stuff. The 2 catalysts that caused the collecting boom to occur again in comic books was third-party grading. CGC was a big part of that. Back in 2000, 2001, when third-party grading hit, it slowly gained momentum. And as a result, that brought confidence into the market. And because of that confidence, you have buyers and sellers now clamoring to get those books. And the term that was thrown about, investment grade, which came out of the coin collecting market, and before that, the art collecting market. So now you had auction companies wanted to getting a piece of that, and they were advertising, you can bid on an Action Comics 1 or whatever it is, Detective Comics 27, Giant Size X-Men 1. Own a historic piece of comic book history. That was the first catalyst that hit. Then right around 2008, 2007, I think it was, you had the very first Iron Man movie being released in the theaters.
Mm.
And Marvel already made plans as soon as Disney acquired Marvel. Hey, we're going to do it Marvel Cinematic Universe. And we're going to put all your favorite comic book characters in real life action format on the big screen. So this created a lot of interest, and that was the second catalyst that hit. So I do see comic books being a little bit different, but the big quagmire that we have to address is younger people growing up are not clamoring to comic books like Gen Xers did, baby boomers did, and older millennials did. What's happening instead is they're bonding with the characters, but they're experiencing them in a different way. They're experiencing them through media, television, movies, and also video games. And this is something that really needs to be looked at, especially while we talk about the decline of physical media, because comic books too are going away. When I was growing up, I grew up in the 80s and 90s. I was born in 1976. So I remember when the first Batman movie hit with Michael Keaton, Kim Basinger, Jack Nicholson. There was a comic book shop on almost every main street in every main town.
That's how I got into comics. I am coming off of the Batman hype. Yeah.
Correct. And it was a mystical, magical experience when you were a kid walking into that store the first time, seeing all of these freshly published books on the shelf that you could pick up and read, and you could interact with your favorite superheroes. Today's kids do not have that same experience. And make no mistake, it is going to affect this market. No different than if we're talking video games. Right now, there's a major push about a lot of the big publishers. They want to do away with physical objects. They don't want physical video games to be produced, because if they do away with the physical item, they can control all the costs associated with this, and their profits go up. So this is something that we really have to discuss, because the future's here. Physical media is going away. What does that mean in the future? What does that mean for a kid that's just born in the year 2023, or even a kid that was born in 2013 who has the collecting gene? Is he more likely to collect comic books as he's growing up, or less? I would argue less, because he has a lot more other options.
Right.
So that's
right.
a major issue.
So what you're telling me is to go all in on NFTs.
Well, no, I don't like NFTs either.
I'm just kidding.
That's a story for another day.
Yeah. Well, let me ask this: maybe this is like a copium, and obviously nobody has a crystal ball, and nobody's actually going to know. But like, I think you're right. I think that's the theory is like, okay, well, kids love the Spider-Man video game, or they love, whoever, Peter Parker or Miles Morales or whatever these characters, and they love going to the movies and the MCU and all this stuff. But is it going to make them buy a comic book? Maybe not. But then is there history still with like sure, they're going to own the Peter Parker NFT or whatever it is, but like nothing will change the fact that historically he came from AF-15. So maybe there will always be some appreciation even in the future for it. I mean, that's the theory. That's maybe the copium, but what do you think about that aspect?
Oh, I would agree. I think that there's
Mm,
always going to be interest here. I just can't see it continually growing like it has in the past.
right.
And that's a problem if you're trying to invest in something, correct? Because you want it to grow in value. And I think 10, 20 years down the line, I think that there's still growth potential in some of these books. But as we go further out, there is going to come a point where the market pulls back as a result of that slowing demand. And we're already seeing that in certain markets, and comic books are not immune. It's just like when somebody tells me, "Well, Shawn, I took my girlfriend to see the latest Batman movie, and I was so hyped up, I went out and I bought a key Batman comic book." You got to understand the type of person who is in that mindset is already a comic book collector. And I even said to the individual, you probably would have already done that if you didn't see the Batman movie when you did. The
Right.
average person who is not a collector is not walking into a movie theater, seeing a Marvel movie, seeing a DC movie, and then going home, logging on Heritage and spending thousands of dollars on a comic book. And they're not, if they do that, they're not going to stay in the market for long because they just only got into that market because of the speculative hype surrounding it. It's not
Right.
authentic.
Right. Well, that's interesting that you mentioned like the hype thing and all that stuff and how much there is. I want to ask you a little bit more about that because you've done some great videos talking about hype and how that sort of drives, a lot of stuff. But let me ask this with the investor side that you just mentioned, this idea of like, I'm going to buy this comic book. Let's say it's even a great comic book, AF-15 or like some, even a golden age book. I don't know this, whatever, it's some pre-code horror golden age book. And I'm going to buy it and I'm going to invest in it. And I'm just going to sit and hold it for 20 years. And then I'm going to buy my private island once I can sell it in 20 years time. Is this actually the way to approach collectibles, or is most money that is made in collectibles, sort of like a arbitrage, finding it at a garage sale and, selling it after you grade it and this sort of thing? Like, can you actually invest in comics? You know what I mean?
You can. The best way, though, as you said, of course, obviously, if you're lucky enough to put yourself out there, you go to a lot of flea markets, yard sales, antique marts, and you come across an item that is selling for a significant discount. I like to use the word discount rather than saying undervalued because usually the people that are selling it, that's what they think it's worth at that particular point in time. So it's not really undervalued, it's selling at a discount. If you can take advantage of that type of arbitrage scenario, you can make significant money in the antiques and collectibles trade. But then you also have to understand you're not doing this passively. This is where we have to
Mm,
factor in opportunity cost, cost of your time,
right.
cost of travel, cost of the fact that you could be working even in a warehouse making $20, $25 an hour moving boxes instead of putting yourself out there looking for this stuff. And most people who enter the market from that standpoint, especially in the year 2023, everybody has a smartphone. Everybody knows what this stuff is worth. The competition is fierce. You really have to get lucky and you have to consistently put
Mm,
yourself out there on a regular basis. It
right.
is work, it is not easy.
Is that something that you advise most people to do if they have like interest in this space? Is that kind of the way? Or is it more like, hey, if you're somebody who is already well to do, you got some excess money, sure, let me buy this, whatever, a Batman one, and I'll just let it sit and whatever happens, happens.
In all honesty, if you want to learn the market, if you really want to learn about antiques and collectibles, the best way to do it is put yourself out there and be exposed to them. On the flip side, however, you have to understand too, and I tell people this, you also have to understand that cost though, because now you're taking time that you could be using to educate yourself in other areas. Like let's say that you wanted to go to law school or you want to take on a second job, or maybe you can get overtime or you can freelance, do whatever. All that has to be taken into account. So that's why I tell people you have to look at the cost of doing business in this market. In the antiques and collectibles trade, knowledge is king. If you want to get that knowledge, there is an expense to gain it. That's why even me, I cannot teach all the facets of identifying and valuing certain collectibles and antiques on my YouTube channel, because some of your best deals, believe it or not, aren't just going to be in collectibles. They're not just going to be in comic books. They're going to be on the antique side of the equation, where really you're going to need years, if not decades, of experience to recognize those potential deals when they come about. Collectibles, the problem with collectibles is everybody's doing it because the barrier to entry is increasingly low. If you want to learn video games or Pokemon cards or vintage toys or comic books, I don't mean to insult anybody in this realm, but it's not on par with edged weapons, high end art,
Yeah.
even coins and currency, which can also be third party grade. You're in a market where it's so saturated because anybody can pick up a copy of the latest Overstreet comic book price guide. They can download GPA on their phone and have access to pricing data if the comic's already graded, and they can pretty much call themselves an entrepreneur and start buying and selling.
Right, right. It's a funny thing, and I think one of the things with the comic books specifically now too, it's a lot of people got in for like the free money in 2021, and now in 2023, going into 2024, I think a lot of dealers or flippers and stuff are definitely having a harder time with it. And I think there's just a lot of competition, not a lot of money going around. Um, I did want to ask about a couple sort of recent sales and a couple of books that went up. Yeah, I mentioned earlier the Action Comics one that sold for $1 million less. I did a video about it. I'm pretty sure you did a video on it as well. There's also the Action one that was the 0.5 that sold for like 400K or something like that. And I covered it and you covered it as well. And I thought it was interesting because it's like, okay, here you have like an Action one that like, there's like two stories here. Like one Action one sells for $1 million less. And then this like other Action one that's not even a complete copy goes for bananas numbers. And maybe it's almost the perfect like picture of here's the randomness of collectibles, any given sale, like, there's no guarantees. You could win, you could lose. Like what were your thoughts on, I guess, just maybe those two instances, or maybe you can kind of recap some of your stuff if you remember it. And you had a funny video where you just talked about how you thought, what was it you're saying? The seller got a good deal on the 0.5. Like, can you talk about that a little bit?
Oh, definitely. That point 0.5 sold for literally like $120,000 more than the previous record. That seller got a great deal, and it just shows the volatility in this market. A big mistake that speculators make when they enter this market is they'll own something like, it could be an Action Comics one, but let's make this more realistic. Let's say that you have an Amazing Spider-Man 300 in CGC 9.8 in your collection, and you see a historic sale for that particular book where it sells for a higher price previously. The mistake that speculators and even some investors in these markets assume then is that their copy is now automatically worth what that particular issue sold for, not realizing that they're not, they have no vested interest in that sale, meaning the auction company and the consigner and the buyer pretty much took part in that particular sale. It's not their book in that auction. So it doesn't necessarily mean just because you own that book that now your book is worth that. You
Mm.
have to find the right buyer to sell it to at that point. This is why I tell people, when you start comparing collectibles to something like an S&P 500 index fund, if I'm sitting at my desk on a Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and the S&P 500 index fund hits a new record, and I decide I want to sell 100 shares, all I do is click the sell button and I'm guaranteed to get that price. With collectibles, it doesn't work that way. The market is not as efficient as the markets for Wall Street, stocks, bonds, mutual funds, ETFs, and the like. And you go on some of these collecting forums, or you listen to some of these YouTubers and TikTokers, they make it seem like it's Wall Street that is more riskier than collectibles, than cryptocurrency, than gold, silver, all these items that do not have underlying cash flows and regulations, big part of this, attached to them either. And that's the main problem that I have with a lot of speculators in these markets. They come into these markets with dollar signs in their eyes, their heart filled with nostalgia. and they think, "Oh, I understand how these markets work," not realizing that there's grading companies, there's auction companies, there's sharks in these markets that understand how these markets are. I don't want to really use the word manipulate it, but how these markets are structured to benefit a lot of the high rollers that play in these proverbial waters, if I can use
Mm.
that as an example.
Right. I think you've talked about the efficient market versus the inefficient market. And clearly, collectibles is very inefficient, and there's people who have advantages when it is inefficient, right? Where it's maybe some of that stuff that people are talking about, like, oh, it's better to be in comic books than it is to be in whatever the stock market. But if I'm going to do the best faith interpretation of what they mean by that, maybe it's because they just have a knowledge base that they can operate in this market, and they know, okay, this is going to sell for 20% under at Heritage. I'm going to do this arbitrage, sell it on eBay, skim a little off the top, and they can do well that way, which you wouldn't be able to do that in the stock market. If you have this, like, I guess you could, right? If you were a day trader and you literally do the same thing, but some people have that knowledge base, and maybe that's where that comes from. But I think generally speaking, you're right that for most people, I mean, most people are most people, and they're not going to be able to sort of pull out that sort of trades, or they're not going to be able to execute in a way unless they really, really, really understand it.
Correct, and day trading is inherently risky. I'm also
Oh, totally. Yeah.
any type of financial speculation, playing with stocks, meme stocks, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah.
I actually believe in a buy and hold strategy. The problem that I see with people who invest in collectibles is that in most cases they don't want to let it go. So it's
Mm.
more, I bought this, I'm confident in 20, 30 years it's going to be worth more. I don't care if the price goes up 10 times. I'm not selling. And I actually have clients that come to me asking me, how can I break that cycle? And what I teach on my channel is, if it's something you think that you can get again, and let's be realistic, most of these comic books that we're all in love with, most, not all, I'm not talking about your Action Comics 1, I'm not talking about your Detective Comics 27, but if we're looking at a giant size X-Men 1, a Werewolf by Night 32, a Amazing Spider-Man 129, an Amazing Spider-Man 300, even an Incredible Hulk 181. These are not rare comic books, even in higher grade. As a result, if you buy one of these books and you can immediately sell it, or even a couple of years later, you can sell it for a profit. I usually encourage people, take the money, do something else with it, buy another comic book if you need to.
Right.
Because if it's not really that rare, you're going to be able to buy it back again. It's just a question of what price level is it going to be selling at.
Right.
And then we got to look at, are these books actually going to become more valuable over time, with also the headwinds against younger generations coming into this market, when there's so many copies of a lot of these key books out there, especially your Bronze Age keys, your Copper Age keys, and don't even get me started on books like Walking Dead 1 or Modern Era keys like Ultimate Fallout 4 and all that crazy nonsense.
Everyone's going to dislike the video right now.
I know. They're going to hate me. I'm used to it.
Yeah. Well, then I do totally agree with you. And, some of the things I always say on my channel and stuff is always just like, look, all that really matters is if you could sell something for more than what you bought it for, you might as well do that, especially if, like you said, it's a comic book that, is fairly common, or you can get it again or whatever, even if it applies to your nostalgia, it's just money, right? Like, you can go on eBay, you can find it, and frankly, you can overpay for it if you just want it back, it'll always be there. Wanted to transition a little bit to the idea of hype, and maybe like in the relationship between the dealer and the collector, and sort of maybe the salesmanship that kind of comes with this stuff. And I'm wondering if you have like sort of thoughts on this. And let me see if I can cook for a bit and set you up with something. I think there's like this idea of, you know, promoting comic books as investments or collectibles, but I'm always going to say comic books because this is the audience. This idea of that, and there's a lot of people in this space that promote it as alternative investment, or they, there's the heritage auctions, right? That they get people hyped up and excited, and or there's shows and stuff, or there's big headline, news articles like we talked about the Action One sells for $2 million, or whatever, articles and things like that. And that plays like a big role in obviously, the excitement in the market and the speculation and people buying into this stuff. And there's a lot of dealers, I think, that maybe also will sell items based on the idea of like, get it now. Oh, the movie's going to come out soon. Get it now. So I think implicit in it is this idea of like buying stuff because it's going to go up in value, and there's some hype attached to that. I guess my question to you is, what do you sort of make of that balance of salesmanship and collectibles and selling sort of this dream or selling this idea of getting rich on a item, and what is ethical and what is not, and what is, okay. And obviously, salespeople got to sell. So
Correct.
there's got to be some balance here. But what do you your thought on all these things?
I'm not concerned with dealers as much as I am with auction companies and grading companies. I will say this, there have been a lot of shenanigans happening. Am I allowed to use that word? Am I old enough to use the word shenanigans? Did I really?
100%. I would use it.
Wow. Okay. Well, with that being said, though, there are a lot of shenanigans that we're seeing in these markets because, again, there's no regulation whenever we're talking about investing in collectibles. They're alternate asset classes, even the court system. The court system has notoriously, especially in the last 10, 15 years, turned a blind eye where, little Timmy paid a high price for something. He's now claiming that was he a victim of an auction company or some other scammer out there that took advantage of his innocence. Courts have ruled in most cases, that Timmy should have knew better. That's really how this is going. So when we look at these markets, they're inherently risky from the standpoint that there is no regulation. So in my personal opinion, I think that it's of the utmost importance that grading companies, dealers, and auction houses all understand that they have an ethical obligation to present these items as they are. Now, with that being said, as a businessman, you have a right to promote your business. So that's where there's a gray area here. And I give more credit to the dealers because let's be realistic. If you have only one dealer that is telling somebody, hey, you need to buy this particular comic book, most people are going to be able to see through that hype. Or if you have a major auction company that keeps priming the pump for a lot of these items, or a grading company is involved, or heaven forbid, a grading company is involved with the auction company, because right now there are grading companies that are owned by auction companies and vice versa, which in my opinion should never be allowed, but it is. That's where you have to look closer and see what is going on here behind the scenes. And you have to be able to see through that hype if you're going to attempt to invest in these markets. And that's where I encourage my audience always to look closer. Look at what's happening in the market, because that's what really caused the massive run up in prices in graded video games, and how that market pretty much crashed as a result of that fallout can all be attributed to where it started. Usually when a market catches fire, you have to look at where the money is coming from. Because for a market to catch fire in the collectibles business in the year 2023, there's a significant amount of money being pumped into that market. So if you follow that money, that's where it's going to tell you, okay, this is either legitimate, this is hype driven, this is complete market manipulation, or it's somewhere in between. That's why with the graded video game crash, when that market first appeared, I was able to see just from what was happening with that appearance from Dennis Kahn on Pawn Stars, I was able to analyze, okay, where's that money coming from? Why all of a sudden, just because this new grading company is on the block now as the new kid, why is this game now selling for hundreds of thousands of dollars? It makes no sense. But if you trace the money back, that's where the answers come at you. Right. So that's where I encourage people to look at. Where's the hype coming from? Is it just one dealer that's stating, hey, this book they're doing a Marvel movie on it. A lot of people want to own this book. I got a lot of customers that are asking me about this book. You can act now and you can add it to your collection. Or is it a lot of collusion behind the scenes with auction companies, grading companies, and the like? There's a big difference between those two polarities.
Right. Am I right to suspect what you mean by that is if someone is buying these really expensive video games and they are just whoever people collectors that genuinely want the games, well, that's one thing. But if it's like dealer selling to other dealer to then private sale to other dealer, that's where it's like, I don't know if this is a real thing. Is that kind of what you're implying?
Exactly. The one thing that I usually tell people is whenever you read in a trade publication, doesn't matter if it's the publication I write for, Antiques and Auction News, could be Antique Trader, could be a set private collectible publication or forum. Whenever you hear about a private sale that took place, always be suspicious because there's a reason why they're telling you about it. Auction sales are meant to be public knowledge, meaning when an auction company sells an item and it goes for a record price, even if there was something going on behind the scenes, we all know that all the news media involved in the antiques and collectibles trade, and sometimes even the mainstream news media, is going to report on that sale. Whenever you see, though, a sale between certain individuals that is made public, you should always be suspicious of that. There's a reason why they are putting that information public. Most people that engage in private sales, myself included, I don't want anybody to know what I'm buying or selling in that regard. If I would ever put it out there, there would have to be a reason for it. And make no mistake, if I'm putting it out there, I'm going to be the one that's benefiting from that reason.
Right, right. I mean, because it effectively it's a PR for whatever thing that it may want to be a PR for. I mean, if it's a book, if it's a Superman one, then guess what? Other Superman ones have that much more desire after that, right?
Correct.
So there's a lot of that. Let me ask this: talking about the efficiency and the inefficiency and that whole state of the market, and not that there will ever be like say a full transparency of comic sales, or as much as I try to people who watch my channel will know, as much as I try to create indexes and try to figure out comic values and try to give us some semblance to like the method of this crazy world, it'll never, like you say, be a perfect system like S&P 500, and you'll never be able to totally figure it out. But there is like this proliferation of things like GPA over the years, and other sites like Go Collect, and there's other apps and tech companies that are trying to get into this space, and there's other things that are trying to come up with Moneyball systems of numbers and trying to analyze comics and collectibles and all this sort of stuff. What would you say, or what do you make of these sort of companies entering the space? And maybe in your say how the years you've been doing this, how has that maybe sort of changed, where we've kind of like taken what was basically the Overstreet Bible, and then we've now kind of put it into this space where, I mean, it's not a perfect system, but there's more numbers to look at. Like, does that make it more speculative now because people pull from this data, or does that make it more transparent in your eye?
It actually makes it more speculative because, first of all, the data is not perfect. Like if we look at GPA, don't get me wrong, I love GPA, I love Go Collect. I think they do serve a purpose, but GPA does not report on comic link sales. They never have since the beginning. So right there, you're leaving out a portion of these sales that could tilt the scale one way or another when we're analyzing the price of these books. Go Collect does a good job, but again, this data is always changing. It cannot capture every sale that is out there. And as a result, I usually tell people, you're going to have to pull from multiple sources. You can't just rely on eBay completed sales. You can't rely on just heritage auction sales. You can't just rely on GPA or Go Collect either. You have to take the aggregate, and you got to learn to do your own research. And even that is going to have faults. This is why I'm a big proponent. I hope that one day we get to a point where artificial intelligence can be used, where it can come together and without bias, pull all of this data in real time so that we have real time true pricing information based on any publicly released sale, whether it hits Comic Link, Comic Connect, Heritage, eBay, even smaller auction houses. I would love to see all of that being compiled together. And up until this point, it really wasn't possible. But with the advent of AI, I honestly think 10, 15 years from now, it might very well be the norm. Do I think that that's going to help the trade? Yes and no. If people utilize that information properly, it will. Whenever you look at pricing data, you have to understand that it is an ad hoc in time. It is not perfect. It just means this is the average price that this item sold for in this date range or at this point in time. It shouldn't be used to state, well, obviously, if it's sold for this price point here, that means in the future it's going to be worth this much, where people are looking for patterns. And it's
Right.
almost like stock investing, people attempting to use Bollinger Bands and all this stupid stuff to analyze at what point is this stock going to accelerate in value or going to go up, 5, 10, 15, 20%. And that's the problem with how a lot of people are using this pricing data. You just got to take it for what it is. Don't try to overanalyze it.
What seems to be anecdotally true, empirically true, and then, if I can look at my YouTube analytics and stuff, I can sort of see who watches my YouTube and stuff. And it tends to be, people above the age of 35, right? Who are, into comic books and this sort of thing. A lot of collectors are, of that sort of baby boom generation. A lot of people I've talked to, in DMs behind the scenes, sorry to be morbid and stuff, always say like, eventually we're going to get to that point where all these baby boomer collections are going to start popping up everywhere. And that's going to tremendously affect, the market or the stability of the market. Do you have any sense of that? Like, as far as, I guess it's kind of coming back into this idea of like, where do you see comics, say, in 15 years, 20 years, 30 years, when eventually all these collections start to pop up? Do you have a sense of what that is, or do you advise certain people as they are maybe in their twilight years? Like, what are they going to do with their comic books? Are they going to just hold them forever? People obviously have a hard time letting go. What's your sort of thought, I guess, on that? This
Well, I can
prime
tell you,
demographic of the collector here that's
just
getting
from my
older.
consulting business, most people, as they get older, of course, their perception changes. When you
Mhm.
have more years behind you than you do ahead of you, that's where, I hate to say it, so I'm going to use a term here, that's where shit gets real in your life. That's where you realize, hey, if I want to achieve certain things, I don't have that much time left to do it. And what I can tell you is what I see is people in their 60s and 70s. There are people that wait to get to their 70s, but most people in their 60s start downsizing. And that's why if we look at what's happening just over the last 10 years, you start to see all of these baby boomer collections that are coming on the market, whether it's Lionel trains, whether it's vintage space robots. Western collectibles were a big thing in the early 2000s. After that bubble burst, there were a lot of Western toy collectibles like Hopalong Cassidy, Bonanza, all of these items that were just being dumped on the market. And there were no buyers, or the buyers were very scarce, simply because the generation that grew up with them got to the point where they realized, hey, I have one foot in the grave. If I want to do anything, or if I want to get the money out of this and pass it along to my family or kids, I better sell now. So you're asking a great question. I will tell you, the problem that I see with comic books is a lot of people cut me up on my channel because not only do I collect comic books, I also collect coins and currency. And
Mm.
I'll keep hearing that's a baby boom collectible, coins and currency. And I have to disagree, because when we look at the demographics, believe it or not, comic book collectors are only 5 years younger than that of coin and currency collectors on the aggregate average. There's only a 5 year difference.
Yeah.
So if people start dumping comic book collections on the market, coin and currency collections on the market, it's going to happen around the same time. These markets do not exist in a vacuum. And this is where I tell people, in my opinion, coins and currency are at least linked to history. When we look at comic books, they're linked to nostalgia. That makes them inherently more risky when comparing other collectibles and antiques within the alternate asset space known as the antiques and collectibles trade. So that's where I am a little bit more cautious to a lot of people that come to me and say, hey, Shawn, I'm 65 years of age. I have these key comic books. What do you advise I do with them? I usually will tell them, especially if they've held this stuff now for 10, 15, 20 years, they made a significant amount of money on these items.
Mm-hmm.
Sell into the market, let it go.
Yeah.
That's really the best advice. Unless if there's something you want to give to, if you have kids, if you have grandkids that want this stuff, maybe nieces and nephews, if you never had kids of your own, there's something to think about. But overall, there's no point in allowing your family to deal with this collection after you pass. Because let's be realistic, the collector has the most knowledge as to what this stuff's worth and what it should sell for on the open market.
Right. Is that what most people who sort of look to your consultation are looking for? Is just sort of, do you find that it's a lot of people that it's like, hey, I have this stuff, I'm maybe in my twilight years, how would you advise me sort of unloading this stuff? Or is it, I guess, across the board?
It's across the board because believe it or not, I get that. But also I get, Shawn, I made a mistake. I bought into the graded video game bubble when you told me not to. Now, how do I get out of this? I help a lot of people get out of situations that they've got into in antiques and collectibles. That's why, going back to what we were talking about at the beginning, this is the stuff that I hear that the average person doesn't understand. That's why how do I want to say this? I'm bearish against these markets at times, or I'm more of a cynic.
Yeah.
Because they see all of those mistakes that are made. And believe it or not, I also have people that come to me and they say, Shawn, I've been collecting for X number of years. I want your advice because I'm thinking of going further into this. I have quite a few people that come to me. Hey, we would like to all have this problem. I inherited $1 million or $2 million. I love comic books or vintage toys. What do you recommend? And usually my advice is not what they want to hear. I tell them, if you want to risk it in this market, I can help you, but just keep in mind, there's no guarantees. This is not like putting your money in a well-diversified portfolio. This is inherently risky. I'm happy to help you, but just understand, my brothers and sisters, there's no guarantee how this is going to end up. So that's where I spend a lot of my time too, doing market research, helping people analyze how best to play these markets over the short term and over the long term.
Yeah. Last couple questions before I wrap up with you. Can you maybe also talk about this idea of letting go or getting people to let go? I assume that might be something that you have to get out of certain people, right? You mentioned it a little bit where it's like, okay, if you have a comic book that sells that whatever 10x and you have it, hey, maybe you should sell your copy, but there's, with collectibles, obviously it's so emotional. We all have an attachment to the stuff, and it's hard for people to let go. And then even too, like, even if you have, like, you start to get really rare things, or maybe you have an original art page, or maybe you have like, when you go up the scale of like, okay, it's not a Hulk 181 anymore. Now it's a Batman one. And then it's like, okay, it's not a Batman one anymore. Now it's a Chamber Chills 19, or, it becomes increasingly more rare and one of oneness. But there has to be a point where you have to sort of let go, and it gets harder to let go, I imagine, as you sort of go up that scale, like maybe even into like fine art, maybe you go into like the other side of the heritage building, right? You start to like buy up these things that are literal one-on-ones, and so how do you, is that something that you consult with people or talk about a bit?
And it is more of a psychological process. The question that I ask to really find the truth is, I will say, if you sold this item today, would you X number of years, X number of months from now, buy it back again? Are you ready to let it go? That's really what you got to start with. I would never, ever, I want to make this very clear because I get a lot of criticism whenever I do a video like this on my channel, where people come into the comment section, oh, you're trying to get collectors to part with their stuff. That is not what any type of ethical consultant in the antiques and collectibles trade does. That is not even what an auction company is supposed to do. When you meet with somebody who has these items, you have to respect that they have an attachment to these items. That's why, like me, I've been collecting since the age of 12. I have an attachment to all these items as well. I can relate. But you also have to find out, are they ready to let it go? If the answer is yes, then in most cases, depending on how long they had it, what they paid for it, there's no time like the present, depending on their age and their circumstances. Some people have the benefit of time on their side. Some people, not everybody, worships money. So it could just be you have somebody that really loves their Batman 1 They've had it now for 20 years and they're still not ready to let it go. There is no right or wrong answer when we're talking about this. It's basically up to the individual and their current circumstances, both economic and also their health situation. There's a lot of people that come to me, "Hey Shawn,
Mm.
these are the ones that break my heart." There's people that come to me and go, "I was diagnosed with cancer. I literally have 2 years to live. I got to now clear out 50 years worth of collectibles so my wife and kids are taken care of after I'm gone." And it breaks your heart. It's a real tearjerker as to what you have to do to help that individual. But it's just something that they've come to the realization that this is their circumstance. They've already accepted it. They're coming to you to help them, and you help them the best you can.
Right, right. Let me finish out then with see if I can get some bullishness out of you, Shawn, for the next few years, or maybe in the collectibles or comics and things like that. I think a lot of people, in my channel, when we talk about stuff, whether it's investing or not investing, or in the even the collecting side of things. Let's say you're somebody who just wants an AF-15. You want to get it, right? But you see prices going down, or hey, like maybe people aren't going to collect comics in 10 years from now. It's like, should I just wait 10 years to buy it when it's, at zero? Like, what do you kind of see, I guess, in comics for the near future or the medium term or the long term? And how should people sort of advise, or how should people sort of operate within their comic investing or collecting journey in the next few years? You got any
Well,
pearls for people?
yeah, let me state this. First of all, it took us decades to get to this point, right? Even
Mm,
2021, the market did pretty much pull back. It did not collapse. So a lot of these items aren't going to go to zero overnight. You guys, if you're watching this channel, you love comic books. I love comic books. You've already seen, if you watch Reserved Investments, I will hold up from time to time a comic book for my collection. I think the most recent video I did was a Batman 232 in CGC 9.6 that I bought from Heritage Auctions recently. So I love this stuff too. What I will tell you is it is not going away anytime soon. In all honesty, you probably have decades. Just understand that the price increases that we've seen in the last 10 to 15 years are most likely not going to be replicated over the next 10, 20 years. I just want to make that very clear. We're probably not going to have the run up like we had before. Now, again, I don't have a crystal ball. I'm just stating, though, your audience doesn't have to worry about, oh my gosh, it looks like this market is pulling back. This guy, Shawn, with Reserved Investments, is stating that after the baby boomer generation dies off, it's going to cause a disturbance in this market. Again, you have 10 to 20 years
yeah.
left for that to occur. So I want to make that very clear. I also want to state I do see opportunity in certain books out there, even still. It's just the books that are more scarce is what I like to go after. So, for instance, I've already brought this up on my own channel. I like Batman 227. I like House of Secrets 92. I like scarce books that may have had a little bit of a run up in price, but they're still scarce compared to your Incredible Hulk 181s or your Amazing Spider Man 300s or your Walking Dead ones. I do not like modern era comic books. And as a matter of fact, I don't like most Copper Age comic books. Even when we get into the Bronze Age, a lot of this stuff is out there in mass. Case in point, I had a guy that contacted me through my YouTube channel. I didn't expect this. He reached out to me. Hey, Shawn, I like to book an hour of your time, but it has to be through Zoom or some type of meeting where I can show you what I found in my storage unit that I was cleaning out. And my jaw dropped. I can pretty much
Mm,
state this because he already gave me permission to talk about this. He had long boxes full, giant size X-Men 1. Amazing Spider-Man 129, Incredible Hulk 180, Incredible Hulk. I mean, the guy hit the mother load.
right.
And these books are all bagged and boarded. I mean, I obviously you can't grade a comic book just on camera. You know what I mean?
Right. Right.
You need to
Right.
see it in person. But I'm seeing these books. I guarantee you, there's going to be some in that pile that grades 9.2, 9.4,
Right.
possibly. Maybe if he would get some of them pressed, a 9.6. So I get into arguments with a lot of people that come into my comments. Shawn, this stuff is 50 years old. It's not being discovered anymore. That is incorrect. And I could share even more stories. And all this stuff is coming onto the market. It's going to get graded. it's going to end up at auctions and the market has to absorb it all. So we're not even at a point where all these collections are absorbed into the market. Then you also have to take into account we have an aging population of baby boomers, Gen Xers as well. I myself am part of Generation X. I'm going to be 3 years away from the age of 50. So we take all that into account. But I still believe that there is opportunity in these markets if you know where to look. Do I think it's going to be as apparent as it was the last 5 to 10 years? No, I don't. But it's still there.
Yeah. Well said. And some good ideas and pearls of wisdom for everybody listening. Shawn, I have taken up a decent amount of your time here. I know you're a busy person, so I want to say thank you so much for hopping on the channel. Before we totally wrap up, maybe you can just kind of let the people know where they can find you if they want to learn more about what you do or your YouTube, and maybe kind of leave them with your channel and how to get in contact.
Well, there's 3 ways you can find me. Number 1 is my YouTube channel, which is literally Reserved Investments. Number 2, if you do have a use for my services, shameless plug, I know. In every video that I put out, there is an email address in the video description. It's reservedinvestments@gmail.com. Feel free to send me an email. And number 3, if you do want to read the articles that I write for Antiques and Auction News, they are published on a bi-weekly basis every 2 weeks, and you can read them at www.antiquesandauctionnews.net. If you want to just read them for free online, if you have access to the print publication, you can also get them that way.
All right. Well, Shawn, thank you so much for your time, and hope you have a great rest of your day, and we'll catch you on the next episode.
Thank you so much.